the scene. He's got the voice that's mean, asking those questions that you never seen. He's got that fire, burning bright and clean. Andrew Keen making waves, break the routine on the Keen on show. He brings the heat, asking the minds, digging deep till they bleed. No sugar-coated truths, no lies to deceive. Andrew Keen, the master of the interview beat. He's got the knowledge, he's got the flair, challenging ideas with a fearless stare. With every question, he's uncovering what's there. Andrew Keen, a truth seeker, he's aware.
Hello, everybody. It's clear who won the election, Trump and Vance, 2024, November 5th. Less clear for some who lost, although it's increasingly becoming clear that perhaps the biggest loser was liberalism itself. We've done some shows recently, one with my old friend Jonathan Rauch from the Brookings Institute, who believes that the election was a moral catastrophe because it represents, if not the crisis, perhaps even the death of liberalism. And we also did a show with David Masciotra recently, talking about this death of liberalism as a reflection of the victory of Donald Trump on November the 5th. I'm guessing that my guest today, F.H. Buckley, who has written a number of speeches for Trump, both in 2016 and in this election, might disagree, not just about the meaning of the election, but about the health of liberalism itself. Frank Buckley has a new book out. It's called The Roots of Liberalism, What Faithful Knights and the Little Match Girl Taught Us About Civic Virtue. F.H. Buckley is joining us from his home in Alexandria, Virginia. Frank, congratulations on the new book. I'm guessing that you don't believe that liberalism in America is dead. Is that fair?
Well, absolutely right. Liberalism was threatened, not, I think, so much by Trump as by the people he was running against, the huge woke establishment in America, which got a tremendous drubbing in the election. I think that was a good thing. And I think as well that people have lost sight of what liberalism is all about. I mean, in terms of the American left, the progressive left, the left in recent years has come out on the side of censorship, right? So it was on the side of free speech 40 years back when it thought it was threatened by the censors, but then it ascended to power and it discovered that it was a lot more fun to be the censor when you were in power and you could blanket up, cover up all those people you disagreed with. So, you know, free speech is a rather basic idea behind liberalism, and it was threatened by the left in the last several years. That helps to explain, for example, the change in Twitter, in X, after Elon Musk took over. He took over, moved it to the right, and became a free speech absolutist. So more or less anything goes right now, which is a great change from the way it was before. So that's one thing it means. Liberalism also has meant that you're to judge people by the content of their character, not by the color of their skin. Well, the party that judges people by the color of their skin is the Democratic Party, both now and in 1861, the party which was on the side of universal ethics, which is the only kind there is, was the Republican Party. So, that's basically liberalism. And once again, the left had departed from liberalism. And then finally, let me speak as someone who emigrated to the United States from Canada. What is basic to the idea of being American, to one's identity as an American, is fidelity to the principles of the framers, or the founders, right? The ideas you'll find in the Declaration of Independence, as restated by Abraham Lincoln, right? And these are ideas that, to be faithful to, you have to have a certain reverence for the founders. Well, when the left discovered that the founders were basically evil ex-slavers, amoral monsters, they were called by a columnist in the Washington Post. That instinctive reverence disappeared, and so did the idea of what it is to be an American. So in that sense as well, the Republican Party was a party of liberalism, and the Democrats had given up on it. So, that's not a comment on what the Democrats were like 50 years back. It's a comment on what they became. And I guess the question now is whether or not they can find their way back.
Frank, obviously you know as well as I do that this is a very controversial position. Not everyone will agree. Some people might be listening to you and thinking, this Republican Party is a party as much, if not more, of race than of than the Democrats, a party of the white working class. You yourself have written about this, actually. One of your previous books was quite prescient in its own way. You wrote a book called The Republican Workers' Party. And of course, the history of the Republican Party is very much about this reinvention of the natural voter in the party. It happened in the 60s with Nixon, then Reagan. You know as well as much more about this probably than I do. Would you reject that entirely? I mean, is that just what woke, in your view, woke propaganda?
Pretty much. I would disagree with you very strongly when you said that I had defended an idea of a white working class. I wrote a book about working class Republicans. Now, I didn't distinguish between different races in any of that. Indeed, happily, the Republicans have picked up support for minority groups. I think that's extremely healthy. So no, I don't. I don't play the racial games that the left does.
So you would reject, Frank, and we've done many shows on this with one kind of historian or another. You would reject the whole premise of the Southern strategy on the part of Richard Nixon, and the turning upside down of American politics in the 1960s and 70s. Is that just more woke propaganda? It didn't really happen, that Nixon didn't wolf whistle, nor did Reagan? All that's nonsense.
Well, I don't think Reagan did. Well, actually, I'm not even so sure about Reagan. But, I wrote a book about politics today. This wasn't a history book about, the way things were. Yes, there was such a thing as a Southern strategy. And it was not a glorious moment in the history of the Republican Party. But look, if you want to judge a party, take a look at its revered figures. It's a party founded by Abraham Lincoln, and it featured Teddy Roosevelt, Dwight Eisenhower, who was very much a civil rights president in the 1950s. There were aspects of even Republican politics in the 1980s with Reagan, which too much concerned itself with issues of race. Reagan, for example, began one of his campaigns in a city where 3 civil rights workers had been killed about 14 years before. That was distressing. However, the Republican Party that I was describing when I wrote about this in 2014 and 2016 was not that party.
You talk about the woke left. I mean, it's become a term that everyone seems to throw around. You wrote an interesting the book, The Republican Workers' Party, in which you describe what you call the new class, I guess, of the woke class. They talk like Jacobins but behave like Bourbons. How, in your view, extensive? I mean, you can always find examples of these kinds of people. Is this an entire class? Is it a university class, an educated class? You were at Harvard Law School. Do they inhabit now all the dominant law schools? Are you suggesting that America is controlled by this woke elite?
No, it's not so blunt as that. It's not so crude as that. And I certainly never said it was as crude as that. But, in general terms, we're talking about a class society in America. Class, not race, was what I was interested in. And what happened in American politics in the last 20, 30 years is a technocratic Democratic Party forgot its roots, its FDR roots as a party of ordinary working class people, and it saw itself aligned to, an educated class. I mean, the educated voters of America are Democratic. The people who have not gone to college tend to be Republican. And I think what has happened is both sides have figured out which side their bread is buttered upon. I mean, the lower class people have been more or less ignored by the Democratic Party. That's not true across the board, but it's true in general with respect to the declining mortality rates of American workers. The absence of jobs. Not all Democrats.
Deaths of despair. Why does this new class, Frank? Why do they talk like Jacobins? I mean, they behave like Bourbons because anyone with power and money probably will inevitably behave like Bourbons. But what is it about the language of the Jacobins that makes itself attractive to this new, in your view at least, dominant class in America?
Well, we're talking about cultural signifiers. We're talking about an educated class, and you may know them by their mating calls, right? The world is flat, call me by my pronouns, all of that sort of stuff.
What do you mean the world is flat?
Oh, yeah, that was Tom Friedman stuff of a dozen years ago. The idea that the really exciting things that are happening in the world are happening in places like China, and we need to open up our trade borders with countries like that. What that did was it eliminated a lot of American jobs, and one paid no attention to that because one thought that one was on the side of history if one paid attention to the people who coded and not the people who worked in coal mines. It was a remarkable transformation. If you know anything about American history, there was a classic 1930s coal strike, a coal miners' strike in Harlan County. It was called the Harlan County War. It really was quite famous, right? And Hillary then in 2016 boasted that she was going to put the coal miners out of work. Well, Harlan County voted 93%, I think, for Donald Trump in 2016, and likely the same this time. So, there was a realignment in which ordinary working class people figured out that the Republicans were on their side and the Democrats weren't.
Are you suggesting then you bring up Tom Friedman and the world is flat, and I'm not going to defend Friedman. I'm not his biggest fan, but I'm not sure he certainly wouldn't agree with your portrayal of him. But are you suggesting that being a globalist is being an anti-liberal?
Well, liberalism doesn't, I think, require free trade. Now, I'm not entirely on board with the Trump people on the subject of tariff barriers. I think that in many cases they're a cover-up for interest group politics. I could certainly set examples of that during the Trump administration. But no, I wrote this book, which is what we were going to talk about, called The Roots of Liberalism. And what I wanted to say was that it really is a product of not philosophers, right? This no great historical problem has ever been solved by a brilliant idea, not liberalism, not anything else. But if you look for where liberalism came from, I think what you're doing is you're looking at basic norms, ideas, stories in our Western culture.
Yeah, and I know that you write about Hans Christian Andersen, and we'll come to him, and Charles Dickens, right, and their association with liberalism. But is there a founding philosopher for you, a founding philosopher for you of liberalism? Obviously, the founding fathers, the Jeffersons, the Madisons, the Hamiltons. Is there someone for whom
One
For
is
you, that liberalism has a father or perhaps a mother?
no, in fact, my book was a story about liberalism before Locke, if Locke was supposed to be the great ancestor figure. I think that the founders are people to whom one feels a special reverence because they are constitutive of one's identity as an American. So you don't depart from that without becoming un-American. So you're rooted in that. But I wanted to go back and talk about earlier sources of liberalism. You mentioned Hans Christian Andersen. I also talked about knights in shining armor. I said, for example, that the story of the Black Prince and the idea of magnanimity at the Battle of Poitiers was something which carried with us, right? And the Code of Chivalry was a proto version of the Geneva Convention. Indeed, I spoke of how one finds that throughout one's culture. One finds it in something which you would not be familiar with, likely, the code of fisticuffs in hockey, right? When Americans, that is, non-Canadians, look at hockey, they say, "Oh my God, it's all these fistfights. What kind of a sport is that?" And what they don't realize is the fights have been follow a ceremony in which magnanimity plays quite a part. You don't just beat up somebody, right? What you say is, when you look at somebody cross-eyed, you say, "You want to go?" And he looks at you and he says, "Yeah," and you both throw down your gloves and you fight. It's a consensual thing. It's like the fights one used to have in school, right? And as well,
So sort of, but is your presentation, Frank, of magnanimity an ethic of the aristocracy? Because, of course, these principles of magnanimity and generosity and bravery, you could have found those, for example, and they were fetishized in the South before the Civil War. Aren't you really fantasizing about an ethic of feudalism rather than democracy?
I don't think so. I'm talking about norms that are basic in Western culture. You seem to want to pull in Southern races often.
Well, I mean,
but I'd like to talk about how we in our culture have these norms. For example, in Western movies, the good guy never draws first. Even Clint Eastwood, in the Man with No Name movies, never drew first. The other guy always did it, and then Eastwood killed him, right? So there are things that are not to be done. There's a code of chivalry and a code of what it means to be a gentleman. That's part of what we learn as we grow.
But the reason I don't want to keep on coming back to the South and slavery, but I mean, the reason why I bring it up is because it's all very well to have these codes, but very often there's a darker reality behind them, just as the idea of chivalry was bound up with knights and, I don't know, crusades and all sorts of other examples of social and intellectual cruelty. So isn't there always something behind chivalry and magnanimity, social systems, Frank, that aren't quite as attractive?
You'd like to find something dark, and you can find something dark wherever you look in our history, in our culture. But I wanted to look at ideas, stories in our culture that were noble and worthwhile and should be emulated. So let's think about them, right? And we can wallow in hatred for America and the Western British traditions and all that as much as you want. I want to talk about something a little more pleasant. And it's all over in our culture. There are other things. For example, there was an idea of large and liberal principles, right? And Booker T. Washington cited them. Booker T. Washington said, he came across people in the North who were just as nasty as people in the South. But he said there was another kind of person who was willing to treat him as an equal. And these were people, he said, who had large and liberal principles. Well, that's, something I want to talk about in terms of what liberalism is all about. There have been various definitions about these sorts of things. They're not meant to be legal codes. They're not meant to be philosophical definitions of what's going on. Think of Cardinal Newman, for example, wrote about what it's like to be a gentleman, right, in his book, The Idea of a University. And that's part of it as well, right? The idea that the gentleman doesn't go out of his way to hurt other people. And
it's interesting you bring up Booker T. Of course, he was one side of an argument with Du Bois about democracy and perhaps nobility, magnanimity. In your argument in Roots of Liberalism, is there an inevitable association between liberalism and democracy? Are these two different things? Because when you talk about nobility and that sort of thing, it might suggest inequality rather than equality.
Well, I think it helps to be an American or a Brit and to identify the idea of equality as rather basic to one's creed. Equality was not something that one heard much of in recent years from the left, where it was all about race, right? So people weren't meant to be treated as equals. There were rather people who were favored and people who were disfavored. And all of that seems to be rather nasty.
Are you thinking of people in particular? You talk about the left. Are there particular theorists who you're thinking of here?
Well, no. I mean, the entire Biden administration was one which wanted to provide for special programs for African Americans. Obama, for example, liked the idea of reparations. And I don't want to get into a debate about reparations, but I think what one should do in America is try to concentrate on programs in which everybody counts as one and nobody counts as more than one. Where one's idea of ethics is rules to count as moral rules should be universalizable. And things less than that don't even count as a moral theory. So, for example, the idea current on the left, one could say Black Lives Matter, but one couldn't say all lives matter. Well, I'm not sure to what extent they really wanted to exclude universalizability as a criterion, but it did sound rather like that. And that was a great mistake. I mean, we're running up against core ideas in the Western tradition, rooted in Christianity, rooted in Kant, rooted in Bentham and people like that. And if you're on the wrong side of that, you're morally diminished.
Yeah, it's interesting. We did a show recently with British sociologist Frank Furedi, who has a book out. I think you'd probably rather enjoy it. The War Against the Past, Why the West Must Fight for Its History, is one of the victims of this woke aristocracy that you talk about. Is it the past? Are we
I think
ignoring the truth of our, although you're not, I mean, the history is a complicated thing, Frank, isn't it?
Yeah. Let me just, if I could, add a little footnote to your comment about Frank Furedi. BA1, McGill University, 1965, we end up sitting side by side. And he at that point is a Marxist, and I at that point am a bit of a Tory. But he's saved. He likes Winston Churchill, so it turns out okay. He worked it all out. Good chap, Frank.
Yeah, no, that is a funny coincidence. Let's get to the core of the argument in Roots of Liberalism. As I said, you talk about Hans Christian Andersen, Charles Dickens. What do these authors tell us about the spirit of liberalism, Frank?
Well, Dickens and Hans Christian Andersen wrote at a time when the culture had invented kindness as the crucial virtue. And that was at a time when we had a great expansion of wealth associated with the Industrial Revolution, but also great inequality. And so you had people like Disraeli and Dickens who pointed that out. And we became aware of it. And it was at the fount of our idea of social justice, right? I've always regarded a welfare state as a kind of a luxury good produced by a wealthy society. You can't have it unless you produce the wealth to finance it. So it's not that it's one or the other, it's got to be both.
So what you mentioned kindness. Are you suggesting that a welfare state is not kind? And what exactly is kind?
I'm suggesting that a welfare state is kind. Look, very early on in 2016, when I was writing speeches, I told Trump's son-in-law, Jared Kushner, that Canadian Medicare was not as bad as people say it is, but we could make it better. And that line Trump used the next day. In fact, we could do something vastly better than Obamacare, I thought. And certainly vastly better than Canadian Medicare. I understand in Canada they've solved their problem of queues. They have something called euthanasia to take care of that nowadays. So I wanted to say that no, liberalism does embrace the idea that you don't want the little match girl to die in the cold, for example. I also said that one of the roots of liberalism for Americans is nationalism, right? I mean, you're made American by your fidelity to the principles of the founders, and if you are a nationalist, you are also on the side of a welfare state to look after people who can't make it by themselves. I mean, look, you can. Richard Rorty said this. Rorty said, "Look, if you're telling me that there's somebody who's really desperately ill, who desperately needs help, you might persuade me that we should do something about it, but you'll get more traction if you argue that it's wrong that a fellow American should live without hope."
Frank, you note that you've written speeches. You wrote a number of speeches with your wife, in fact, for Trump in 2016. Is Trump a liberal in your view? Or was he? And is he still one?
Well, he is not an intellectual. I'll grant you that.
No, well, that's not news, Frank.
Okay. I thought I was helping you. I don't think he's had to think about things, but his instincts were liberal. I mean, in fact, that's what attracted me to the Trump movement early on. I mean, when I first got in touch with Jared, for example, he said, "Look, this is 2016." He said, 2 years ago, I was a Democrat. I thought, that's great. You've got a sense of where we should be. What you aren't, and my principal enemy was the Goldwater wing of the Republican Party, the free market purists, Mitt Romney being one other example of that. I thought the party had to burn all those people off and embrace a very different kind of economic policy. And what Trump provided was what I call the sweet spot in American politics, which is a measure of social conservatism and economic liberalism. And in fact, as far as social liberalism is concerned, I mean, he was not anti-gay in any sense. I recall being at one of the parties at Inauguration Day, and somebody got up and said, "Our gays are better than their gays." And I thought, that's great.
Yeah, and of course, he was taught his politics by a very distinguished American gay, Roy Cohn. Have you seen the film The Apprentice? There's a lot of gay sex in that, Frank.
Was that
Trump watches? I don't know if he doesn't participate. It seems slightly shocked. I wonder, the reason I ask you about Trump being a liberal is because you make this issue of kindness so central to your definition and treatment of liberalism. One can say a lot of things about Trump, whether you like him or not, but I'm sure even his biggest admirers, probably even his wife and kids, wouldn't describe him as kind. Or am I being unfair?
I think he is kind to Americans. I think he has a sense of empathy to fellow Americans, which does not extend to foreigners. And because on the left, one doesn't distinguish between Americans and foreigners, that's taken as unkindness.
It doesn't seem very generous. I mean, some of his speeches about immigrants are not particularly kind, are they? I mean, that word doesn't come to mind. It's not the first word I would associate with him.
Well, he employed an immigrant to help write speeches for him. So he's not down on immigrants. He's down on illegal immigrants. He thinks
Sorry, go on.
He thinks there should be a screening mechanism to admit people who are going to make life better for Native Americans and exclude other people. That makes perfect sense to me. I mean, that's really what nationalism is all about, isn't it?
Well, I'm not so sure. I mean, you spanked me, Frank, already for bringing up slavery, so I won't do that one again. But I'll bring up fascism. You talk about Trump being kind to Americans, which may be true, certainly his version of Americans. But couldn't one say the same about, I don't know, Mussolini, for example, that he was kind to Italians?
Are you listening to yourself? I mean,
I'm trying. Is that an absurd thing to say? I'm not comparing Trump to.
Yeah, if the idea is, look, let's talk about fascism and the extent to which you share in the principles of fascism. Give me a break.
No, but this idea of being kind to Americans, are you suggesting that it's okay? I mean, you're a kind person, you're a liberal if you're kind to Americans, even if you're loathsome to everybody else?
Well, loathsome is your term. I don't think that accurately describes how Trump feels about Brits or French people or Canadians even.
Or even Norwegians.
Or even Norwegians, right? So, no, I don't think that a preference for fellow citizens is per se evil, which is, I think, what you're more or less suggesting.
No, I'm talking about kindness,
Right.
which is your definition of liberalism.
Yeah, but are you saying that kindness for Americans necessarily means unkindness for everybody else? Is that kind of a world you live in?
Well, I'm not convinced that if you're an extreme nationalist, I mean, obviously there are elements that we're all nationalists one way or the other. We all associate with our own group. But if you're an extreme nationalist and you call Trump, for example, kind to Americans, does that? I'm not sure that necessarily reflects a broader kind of philosophical kindness.
Well, in the abstract, it might or it might not. So in the case of Hitler, you haven't used the Hitler.
I was careful there. You brought him up.
Yeah. Okay. So in the case of,
I mean, was he kind to Germans?
in the case of people who are the extreme nationalists you're describing, they might indeed be terribly unkind to other people or to minorities, within the country. But that's not what we're talking about, right? So I guess what I'd like to say is it is possible to have a preference for fellow nationals, which is not illiberal.
Do you think, though, we've had a lot of people on the show worried about the rise of one kind of authoritarianism or not? I won't bring up the F word again, but people like Orban, I mean, they're certainly very kind to Hungarians, or Modi kind to Indians, or Erdogan kind to Turks. Is this the nature of 21st century politics, for better or worse, Frank?
There's a movement called national conservatism, which I am at some pains to distinguish myself from in the book. I mean, the national conservatives are people who like Orban. And I think that's a terrible mistake. I think that, the thing about being American is if you are faithful to the principles of the founders, that necessarily excludes the Orbans of the world, right? So we don't have to worry about that, right? Moreover, those people, the National Conservatives, were basically right-wingers who wanted to find a politically correct way of saying they were signing on to the Trump's nationalism agenda. But I fault them for being right-wingers and indeed not talking sufficiently about the need for a good welfare state, right? That is to say, if you really are a nationalist, then you have to feel a special fraternity, a special loyalty to fellow Americans, which would embrace a welfare state, a safety net for people who, through no fault of their own, need help. So nothing wrong with that. That's absolutely admirable, and that's one of the positive signs, one of the byproducts of nationalism in the view of Richard Rorty.
Yeah, it's and I'm not surprised you're not keen on Orban. He prides himself on his illiberalism. You've talked about the welfare state several times. Trump has already announced that he wants to make the state more efficient. He doesn't use the term welfare state. But do you think what he's asking people like Elon Musk to do is build a more efficient welfare state in the 21st century? And in that sense, then, he's rather kind, and that his regime may reflect a modern kind of liberalism?
I don't think one wants to make an argument for waste, period. So if there are things we do which are wasteful, and indeed much of the regulations we're describing are a safety net for the elite class and not for ordinary Americans. I think the kinds of things that Elon Musk will want to get rid of are those kinds of regulations which employ the elites in a regulatory state, but don't do a damn thing for anybody else. And more power to him if he can get rid of all of that.
Were you surprised with Trump's victory? I mean, you said you've written some speeches about him in 2022. You wrote in a Wall Street Journal op-ed that Trump can't win another presidential election. You've also written about the Republican Party needing to embrace Trumpism rather than Trump. So getting beyond Trump, is Trumpism the new liberalism, Frank, in your view?
No, but it carries within it the seeds of liberalism. We've talked about a lot of things and spent a lot of time on the welfare state. I mean, it may be the case that I brought with me when I came from Canada a certain red Tory element to all of this. My heroes were people like Disraeli, for example. I thought that what was remarkable about Trump was he had a similar vision about what would be good for Americans generally. As for my ability to predict Trump's staying power, I admit I blew that completely.
What about the role of monarchy here? Can one be a liberal monarchist? It would seem that the current King of England might conform to your idea of nobility, kindness, magnanimity. You note that you grew up in Canada. You're a red Tory. Should America just have a monarchy? Might it make it a kinder, better place?
Well, I wrote a book about parliamentary versus presidential government. I wrote several books on the subject of Canada versus the US, always to the advantage of Canada. And with respect to parliamentary government, I'm a great fan of Bagehot, and was vastly amused at how, the TV series The Queen was really an advanced seminar on Walter Bagehot. Look, the presidential system fairly beckons a Charles de Gaulle to the Elysee Palace, right? In almost every country to which America exported its constitution, it ended up with the one-man rule of a president for life. And it didn't happen here. And that it didn't happen could be attributed to a kind of American exceptionalism. we had a kind of political virtue under which we retained our liberalism in spite of our Constitution. It's not our Constitution that made America free. America is free in spite of its Constitution. But there was something else going on, a kind of political virtue, the kind of, bargaining that's necessary to make things work in this country. It comes with a certain amount of corruption, right? But in general, until recently, one had as much chance of getting legislation passed in periods of divided government as in cases where all three branches were held by the same party. So that's the past. The problem right now is we've diverged so much. It would be nice to think that the Democrats would see some sense in junking some of their extreme beliefs, and as well a Trumpified Republican Party, which is not a Goldwater party, which is willing to bargain over things like a welfare state. That as well might be a way in which we can make things work in America in spite of our Constitution.
Don't the Democrats, though, Frank, do aristocracy best? FDR, of course, was a remarkably successful aristocrat on every level, perhaps the greatest American president, certainly of the 20th century. Had Bobby Kennedy not been assassinated in 1968, he might have made another great aristocratic, democratic, if not king, president. Have you written off, perhaps unwisely, the Democratic Party for reviving that kind of aristocratic liberalism that you admire?
Well, FDR's aristocratic liberalism, as you call it, was a popular liberalism which really did aim to make ordinary Americans better off, and indeed he did so wonderfully. I mean, the guy who's written that up well is my friend Conrad Black, who noted that in the first 4 years of FDR's administration, 1933-37, America had a 10% annual growth each year. Nothing like that has ever happened before. I mean, except maybe in China, right? Absolutely remarkable. No, what happened to the Democratic Party 50, 60, 80 years later was it didn't care about that. It didn't care. It didn't care about spreading the wealth. It cared about GDP. It didn't care about the pockets of inequality and immobility within the country. The immobility is indeed the big one. There was something called the American Dream, and which is what got me started in all of this back 10 years ago. The American Dream is whoever you are, wherever you're from, you can get ahead and your kids will have it better off than you did. And in 2014, for the first time, Americans said we no longer believe that. And in fact, they were right not to believe it. I mean, the really mobile countries in terms of intergenerational mobility are places like Denmark and Canada. And so, we've made a number of mistakes involving things like higher education, which they didn't in other countries, with the result that they're mobile and we're not. I mean, if you look at immigration, for example, and you want to find an example of an immigration system geared towards making native people better off, try the Canadian system, right? The thing about the two countries which I discovered is that the ostensibly right-wing American government is actually far more liberal than Canada in many respects. In Canada, this red Tory country is actually much more free market in many respects than America. So,
final question, Frank. You've also written about the role of humor in culture, society, politics. Is the heart of liberalism in some ways just an ability to laugh, to find things funny? And perhaps that's the biggest problem with the left in America today. I'm certainly not the first or the last person to make this point, that Democrats have forgotten how to laugh.
Right. There was one great theorist of laughter, Henri Bergson, who wrote 100 years back a book called On Laughter. And what he said is you laugh at people who are rigid, not flexible, right? The guy who slips in a banana. And the kind of rigidity he had in mind, I think, is one you also see in political movements and ideologies which get fixated on pushing their ideas without caring over much about how things actually work out. That's laughable.
F.H. Buckley, author, The Roots of Liberalism. Interesting book, interesting position. Keep doing your business, Frank. It's interesting to have you around. We'll have to have you back on the show in a year or two to see what you think of the new Trump regime. Thank you so much, Frank, and best of luck with The Roots of Liberalism.
Thank you so much.
Can I step on the scene? I'm ready to attack. Andrew Keene. Yeah, he's the one to bash. Asking questions, no filter, just keeps on grinning. He's the man who's got the whole crowd spinning. Money, fame, success, it's all in his sight. He'll dig deep, expose you with all his might. No sugarcoating, he'll cut right through. Andrew Keene, he's the one to spew. Yeah, he's an expert.